In our article, a note on the relationship between additive separability and decomposability in measuring income inequality, myself and Ben Fine, we look at two foundational approaches to inequality measurement. And a very short answer would be, we show how and under which conditions they are equivalent. But let me elaborate a bit. So Tony Atkinson and Shorrocks, examples of two theoretically based approaches to measuring inequality. Atkinson is a representative of what's known as the social welfare function approach to income inequality measurement, and Shorrocks of the axiomatic approach. Although these are the two main approaches to measuring inequality in a more systematic, theoretically deep manner, and a lot has been written about them, a series of derivations, further work on their approaches has been done. So far, nobody had properly explained why the class of measures that they arrive at, the class of income inequality measures that they derive, are not the same. So we have gone through their approaches, going through the derivation of their measures, and shown why are they different. Technically, it is down to the differential equation that they solve, and this is underpinned by the conditions that they impose, one on the social welfare function, the other the axioms that the income inequality measure must satisfy. All of that is in the paper, so I won't go into too many details. But then we show how there is an implicit social welfare function to Atkinson's axiomatic approach. So there's an underlying commonality between the two approaches that had not been properly noticed and explained in the literature. And we show how they can be rendered compatible. What are the further conditions and constraints that have to be imposed on either of them so that they are made compatible. So a main contribution with this paper is to show how and under which conditions these two foundational approaches to measuring inequality are compatible, and what are the implications of this when we look into inequality measurement and the ethical considerations that go into that. In the first answer, but let me expand somewhat on it. So it said that these two main traditions to measuring income inequality, or inequality more generally, using income as shorthand here. There is, of course, a third approach, which is not based on theory, but essentially just uses a statistical measure and goes on to look whether inequality has increased, decreased, what has happened. But in these two more theoretical traditions, social welfare function and the axiomatic approach, their relationship had not been studied in this way. At least nobody had shown until now under which conditions Atkinson and Shorrocks are rendered compatible. And we offer some technical satisfaction to this, showing where the difference arises, how it can be rendered equal, and so on and so forth. But it also draws attention to further ethical considerations in measuring inequality. In particular, we draw attention to the implicit social welfare function that exists in Shorrocks's approach, and we show how Atkinson can be modified to be made compatible with Shorrocks, and which further degrees of liberty in a loose sense are gained with this. In particular, we show how in both of these approaches, there is an implicit consideration of how aggregate welfare is considered in the inequality measures. Although these measures are scale invariant, so you can double average income and they won't change. Nevertheless, there is a consideration of how aggregate welfare goes into them, which is constrained unless we change some of these conditions, as we do in the article. So essentially, what we're doing in this dimension of the article is to show that, again, implicitly, but inescapably, these measures have a consideration of whether inequality, or let's say equality, is a luxury good or is it a basic good? So should we care more about inequality, and our measures reflect that, when income levels are lower or higher? And this is something that, again, has not been commented upon extensively in the literature, and we draw it out showing how it is both implicit and inevitable in these measures. I'll point out two main things. One is this can be taken in a multidimensional setting. So we have discussed here inequality for a single dimension, variable, be it income, wealth, what have you. But there is a large strand of the literature that is about the measurement of multidimensional inequality. So including in one single measure things like income, education, health status, you name it. We could look at this from the multidimensional perspective. And in particular, what would be the contribution of this approach would be more towards perhaps a critique of multidimensional inequality measures, or at least exploring the challenges of building a meaningful multidimensional inequality measure. The literature has touched a lot upon the difficulties of combining, of aggregating these different dimensions into a single measure. What our approach here shows is the implicit ethical considerations with that. How do we talk about inequality across a range of different outcomes, and how do we deal with issues such as the importance of aggregate welfare, or whatever is the specific thing being measured across dimensions. For all of them, how do we bring that together? So exploring that could be one avenue. And it's in a sense two. One is building a measure, a multidimensional inequality measure that uses this. The other sub-avenue there would be a critique of the notion of multidimensional inequality as a single measure based on these results. The other different route that can be taken is one that Ben Fine and myself have done in a recent paper that came out in the International Review of Applied Economics, and that is to drop the condition of symmetry in measuring inequality. Symmetry meaning that individuals or groups are treated equally. And what we show with that, very, very briefly indeed, is given that we might want to compare groups, that is one of the key points of Shorrock's approach, that the measures be decomposable. The notion of symmetry being a necessary condition does not necessarily make sense. That we might have good reasons to treat groups differently because they might experience different conditions, their welfare might be different, and so on and so forth. And based on that, we compare these measures, we derive the properties, and we apply that in the context of Brazil to changes in the labor market in Brazil over the past decades, looking at the position of white men and black women, considering that the welfare that they derive from their income is systematically different. So in sum, we can take this in a multidimensional direction, or we can further investigate, inquire, interrogate the assumptions that are usually proposed for inequality measures and apply them to specific cases and look at something that hasn't really been been the focus, at least, of the income inequality literature, which is discuss what do these measures mean, what do the cardinal values mean, how do we interpret this, what are the welfare considerations that we can draw based on that.